Hey there, it's Dr. Vivian Lowe. You're on VLMD Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. Today's topic is going to be on cholesterol. Now, generally, when we talk about cholesterol, we tend to talk about what foods have a lot of cholesterol and how you should avoid those foods because cholesterol is so bad for you, according to the general medical world. And, there's this big thing about how cholesterol is causative for atherosclerosis and heart disease. And therefore, we should minimize the cholesterol levels in our body through our diet and also through medications. I find it kind of strange that nobody presents the other side of the story, which is that cholesterol is absolutely necessary for life. We wouldn't be alive if we didn't have any cholesterol in our body. Cholesterol is very important in cell membranes, and we wouldn't have cells without the cell membranes, right? And they're very much also involved in the formation of steroid hormones and so forth. So absolutely necessary for life, but no one will tell you that when you have no cholesterol or too little cholesterol, that might be a problem as well. It's always in the context of high cholesterol only. And then at the other side, we also have people who say, well, it's not really the cholesterol that's the problem, it's oxidized cholesterol. And that's what's causing the inflammation and the heart disease and so forth. So the cholesterol itself is fine. It's the oxidized cholesterol that's causing problems in our bodies. That's why I thought it might be a good idea today to just have a general look at cholesterol and some of the things it does in our body, and also to look at oxidized cholesterol and what those things do in our body. Let's go. Okay, we can start with cholesterol metabolism. Okay, so the first step in breaking down cholesterol in your body is actually oxidation of the cholesterol, and then we're going to form oxidized forms of cholesterol or oxysterols. And the thing about oxysterols is they are very good at crossing plasma membranes much quicker than cholesterol, right? They just bioactively able to cross membranes very quickly and therefore be involved in signaling. Now, different tissues and cells in your body make different types of oxysterols, and these oxysterols can be esterified, which means they're combined with fatty acids, and then they are transported in lipoproteins. Now, a small proportion of those sterols become steroid hormones. They used to make steroid hormones in our body. The majority actually just are converted to bile acids. And bile acids are primarily made in the liver, although some of the initial steps can be seen in other tissues such as the lung and also the brain. And as you know, bile is really important in emulsification of fat, so it helps with absorption of fat in your digestive tract. And they also have antimicrobial action, which can be protective for your gut. And a large proportion of bile acids, 90%, are actually reabsorbed from the small intestines, and then they're recycled back to the liver for usage. Now, let's briefly look at oxidized cholesterols or the oxysterols. And we have different forms of them in the body. So some examples would be the 1-alpha 25 dihydroxyvitamin D3. That's an oxysterol. We have 24S hydroxycholesterol, which is the major cholesterol in brain metabolism. We have 25 hydroxycholesterol, 22R hydroxycholesterol, which is the first metabolite of cholesterol in the steroid hormone biosynthesis pathway. Okay, we have things like 7-alpha hydroxycholesterol, which is part of the neutral pathway of bile acid synthesis. We have 27 hydroxycholesterol, and that's the first member of the acidic pathway of bile acid synthesis, because there are generally these two pathways, the acidic and the neutral pathway. So as you can see, we form a lot of these different forms of oxidized cholesterol in our body. So when we say oxidized cholesterol, that's a huge category just to begin with. And when people talk about oxidized cholesterol in the context of things like neurodegeneration or atherosclerosis, they generally don't specify the type of oxysterol. They just kind of have this broad, overview, and they say oxidized cholesterol, and they're bad for you. But you can see that there's so many different forms of oxidized cholesterol, and we really need to be specific when we're talking about oxysterols. These oxysterols are bioactive, especially the side chain oxysterols. And when I say side chain oxysterols, what I mean is that they are oxidized in the steroid side chains. Okay, so these are specifically very bioactive, and they can, as I said, cross lipid membranes very quickly and be involved in immunomodulation, among other things, and metabolic regulation as well. Okay, now let's go to cholesterol synthesis. I won't go through the entire pathway. All I'll say is that cholesterol is made from acetyl-CoA, and there are over 20 enzymes that are involved in that pathway. Okay, so it's a long pathway there. But what is important to know is that generally it's regulated by a master transcription factor called SREBP2, or sterol regulatory element binding protein 2. And this transcription factor really is involved in regulating the enzymes, right? The production of the enzymes that are necessary for the synthesis of cholesterol. All the enzymes are regulated by this transcription factor. And in fact, the LDL receptor is also regulated by SREBP2. And, your cell really has a beautiful process to regulate cholesterol in itself. So what happens is SREBP2 is made as a protein in the endoplasmic reticulum, and then it immediately binds to a transport protein called SCAP, all in caps, SCAP. And the SCAP protein is going to transport the SREBP2 to the Golgi. And when it gets to the Golgi, we now cleave it, we process it, and we make it into the active SREBP2 transcription factor, which goes to the nucleus and activates the transcription of different genes that are involved in cholesterol synthesis. Okay, so generally that's how it works. So again, we make the SREBP2, and then it's bound to SCAP, and SCAP just escorts it, transports it to the Golgi. There it gets processed even more, and it becomes active, goes to the nucleus, and activates transcription of genes. Now, when you have a situation of low cholesterol, that's generally what happens, and we have now the activation of cholesterol biosynthesis. However, when the cell senses that the internal cholesterol environment is high, it actually regulates the cholesterol synthesis, because the cholesterol itself will bind to SCAP. Okay, so now we have a lot of cholesterol in the cell, and that cholesterol is going to bind to that SCAP protein. When that happens, the SCAP protein, which is bound to SREBP2, right, that whole complex, gets bound or tethered to another protein in the endoplasmic reticulum, and this is called INSIG, all in caps, INSIG. Don't worry about the name, but it's just easy to refer to. So now cholesterol binds to SCAP, and SCAP is going to bind to INSIG. And the end result is it's tethered, it's bound to INSIG and cannot move from the endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi. And as a result, we don't get cleavage of SREBP2, it can't be activated, and then we actually don't get the synthesis of cholesterol, which is a good thing because after all, the cell is sensing that it has too much cholesterol, and so it's regulating the synthesis to shut it down. Okay, now cells that have the LDL receptor, for example, and they take up cholesterol via receptor-mediated endocytosis, and I've talked about this in previous episodes. So these LDL particles bind to the LDL receptor and they become internalized as endosomes, and they fuse with the lysosome and they get degraded there, and the LDL receptor is recycled back to the plasma membrane. Meanwhile, the cholesterol esters there are hydrolyzed by the lysosomal acid lipases, and then free cholesterol is moved back to the plasma membrane, and then eventually it can get back to the endoplasmic reticulum when we have high levels of cholesterol. And when that happens, again, it will regulate the activation of SREBP2, and in that case of high cholesterol in the cell, shut down cholesterol synthesis. All right, when we talk about cholesterol, really most of the cholesterol in the cell, as I said earlier in a different episode, most of it is in the plasma membrane. And in the plasma membrane, you can think of 3 different pools of cholesterol. One is sequestered by sphingomyelin, and that's 15 mole % of the plasma membrane lipids. Okay, and when we say it's sequestered by sphingomyelin, we generally mean the lipid rafts, right, which are enriched with cholesterol, and these rafts are very important because a lot of signaling proteins and receptors sit on those rafts. Okay, so we have one pool that's in those rafts and somewhat sequestered in those rafts. Then we have 12 mole % of plasma membrane lipids that are sequestered in different ways, other ways. I'll just say other ways, okay? And then we have 16 mole % that are what we call accessible cholesterol. And this is the cholesterol that is available to cycle back and forth between the plasma membrane and the endoplasmic reticulum, and therefore be involved in regulation of SREBP2. Okay, so it's really that free, accessible cholesterol generally that gets involved in the regulation of SREBP2 pathway. All right, let's move on now and just briefly talk about liver X receptors, or sometimes they're just referred to as LXRs, all in caps. LXRs or liver X receptors. These are actually oxysterol receptors, so they bind to these modified oxidized forms of cholesterol. And their target genes code for cholesterol transport proteins ABCA1 and ABCG1 that I talked about in previous episodes. They also code for ApoE and inducible degrader of LDL receptor, among other proteins. Now, generally, when we activate the LXR receptors, okay, the overall effect is just to decrease the cellular levels of cholesterol. Okay, so that's an easy way to think about what the general function of LXRs are. It's just to decrease the overall cellular cholesterol levels. And of course, they interact with SREBP2. So there's crosstalk between LXR and SREBP. Okay, now let's go on to look at some of the effects of oxysterols in the body. So I'm going to start with an oxysterol that's called 25-hydroxycholesterol. Okay, so this one is interesting because it's really involved in immune regulation. We know interferons and our proteins, cytokines that are involved in immune cell signaling, and they trigger defense mechanisms against different pathogens, different viruses, and bacteria. Now, type 1 interferon is produced by macrophages, fibroblasts, endothelial cells, right? And again, I discussed this in the episode on innate immunity, so you might want to look at that. So we have these pattern recognition receptors, or PRRs, and these are able to recognize specific motifs that are seen in pathogens, in viruses, in bacteria. And then they get activated to trigger an immune response. So some of these pattern receptor recognition receptors would be things like TLR4, TLR3. And what happens is we get an activation of macrophages and dendritic cells. These are the antigen presenting cells of the innate system by TLR4 or TLR3 binding. And what happens then is we get the induction of interferon beta. And when that happens, we upregulate CH25H gene. That's the gene for producing the enzyme to make cholesterol, 25-hydroxylase cholesterol. Okay. Now, when we have this 25-hydroxycholesterol increase, then it plays a role in adaptive immunity, because what it can do is suppress the formation of immunoglobulin A production by the B cells, right? So that's one way that 25-hydroxycholesterol can regulate your immune system. And in addition, it actually inhibits SREBP2 and decreases cholesterol biosynthesis, because these oxysterols also regulate SREBP2. The only difference is that, how I said that cholesterol can bind to SCAP and then now tether SCAP, the SCAP SREB2 complex to the INSIG protein, right? And not then be able to move to the Golgi. Well, the oxysterols do a similar thing, except they actually bind directly to INSIG, and then SCAP binds or is bound and tethered to INSIG as a result. And now that whole complex cannot move to the Golgi. So the end result is the same, just the pathway is a little bit different. But the oxysterols give the end result of really inhibiting the activation of SREBP2 and therefore decreasing the biosynthesis of cholesterol. And when this happens, then we, basically don't allow the formation of interleukin 1 beta, and, we get an inability to actually activate those macrophages, because high cholesterol synthesis is required for activation of interleukin 1 beta release by macrophages. Okay, so that's one way, again, that it can interact with the immune system. We also have these things that are called cholesterol-dependent cytolysins, and an example would be PFO, or pore-forming toxin, and this is secreted by gram-positive bacteria such as Clostridium perfringens. Okay, now what happens is the 25-hydroxycholesterol in this case is actually protective for macrophages and neutrophils against the CDCs that are formed by the Clostridium, right? These CDCs are pore-forming toxins that can cause the formation of pores in cells, and then those cells lyse and die. So 24-hydroxycholesterol protects our immune cells, the macrophages and the neutrophils from this reaction. And the way, again, this happens is those pattern recognition receptors are activated on the macrophages, and we have now interferon production, and that will stimulate the enzyme that will make 25-hydroxycholesterol. So now we have increased levels again of 25-hydroxycholesterol. That, as an oxysterol, binds to INSIG and doesn't allow the activation of SREBP. And that way, we are now not going to have this upregulation of cholesterol in macrophages and neutrophils, and this will decrease the cholesterol-dependent cytolysin binding and pore formation. Okay. Now, the other thing that 25-hydroxycholesterol will do is it also induces degradation of HMG-CoA reductase, which is an enzyme that's very important in the cholesterol synthesis pathway. So not only are we not activating SREBP2, we're also really degrading the HMG-CoA reductase, and we can also activate LXRs to induce more cholesterol export. And the end result is to decrease cholesterol levels in those cells. And now the cholesterol-dependent cytolysins cannot bind because they need to bind to cholesterol. And then we don't have the formation of pores in our immune cells. So that's protective for the immune cells. So we've heard some good things about 24-hydroxycholesterol, but it actually truly can have pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory effects, really dependent on the context, the different tissues, right? It also has regulatory effect on sphingomyelin synthesis, and this is important in lipid rafts. As you know, we have T-cell cross-linking with those lipid rafts. And again, if you're not able to form good lipid rafts, that's going to impact really the T-cell actions in your body. Okay, so that's one oxysterol and how it impacts the immune system. Let's go now to the brain. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, the brain makes its own cholesterol, mostly unesterified cholesterol, free cholesterol. And in adults, there's continuous turnover of membranes and myelin, and the cholesterol is then recycled. The half-life of cholesterol in the brain is about 5 years, up to 5 years, all right? So pretty long. Now, the rate of cholesterol synthesis is a bit more than what's required, what the brain actually requires. So there's actually some movement of cholesterol out of the brain so that it can be cleared from the brain. And what happens is that the cholesterol is processed by an enzyme to become 24S-hydroxycholesterol. And that's 50 to 60% of all cholesterol metabolism in the brain. Okay, so this 24S-hydroxycholesterol can easily, remember, these oxysterols can cross membranes very easily, so it can easily flow out of the brain and into the circulation at a rate of between 3 to 7 milligrams per day. And once it gets out of the brain, it's transported via lipoproteins to the liver and then converted to bile acids and excreted that way. Okay, now 24S-hydroxycholesterol and another oxysterol called 24S25-epoxycholesterol, they regulate cholesterol homeostasis in the brain. And 24-hydroxycholesterol regulates the transcription of ApoE and is also an agonist of nuclear LXR. So it really helps export cholesterol from the cells. The 24S hydroxycholesterol actually down-regulates amyloid precursor proteins in the brain. High levels are seen in patients with neurodegenerative disease. If we look in the brains of those patients, we actually find high levels of this 24S hydroxycholesterol, and the elevated levels can lead to neuronal death. Now, they can also be protective, right, paradoxically, against tumors like glioblastoma via LXR activation, right? So again, we see that we have these oxycholesterols, but depending on the context, on the one hand, it could be that it could lead to neuronal death in neurodegenerative diseases, but it can also be protective against certain tumors in the brain, like glioblastoma. And we also see 25-hydroxycholesterol increase in neuronal diseases like Alzheimer's. But at this point, the significance is unclear to us, right? There's just still so much more to learn about them. One other thing I will mention about the 24S 25-epoxy cholesterol. That one is, we see that in the brain, but it's also important because it prevents foam cell formation by smooth muscle cells in the arteries. And this is because it actually decreases the LDL receptor mediated uptake, and it stimulates cholesterol efflux. And as a result, it prevents foam cell formation by those smooth muscle cells. Okay, now we have a different oxysterol, and this time, this one comes from the bloodstream and goes to the brain. This is called 27-hydroxycholesterol. It diffuses from the blood into the brain, where it's rapidly converted to a metabolite that I'll simply refer to as 7-HOCA, because you don't want to know the full name. Oh, you do? Okay. Well, it's 7-alpha-hydroxy-3-oxo-4-cholestinoic acid. Yeah, that's why we'll just call it 7-HOCA. All right. And this actually we've seen accumulate in patients with Alzheimer's disease in their brains, but we're not sure what the significance of that would be. Sometimes people say, could this be involved in, the disease process? But most people are thinking this is just from the death of neuronal cells that contain the enzyme that would actually help to process the 27-hydroxycholesterol. Okay, so if you don't have the enzymes, then you're going to accumulate the 27-hydroxycholesterol in the brain, because that is an oxysterol that does get into the brain. So I mentioned that because, in the brain cholesterol episode, specifically when I talked about ApoE, I said that your brain makes its own cholesterol, and generally cholesterol from the circulation doesn't go into the brain. They are different pools of cholesterol, except for oxysterols. I didn't put that in there because I was going to do this episode. So, one thing per episode. So these oxysterols, especially 24-hydroxycholesterol, that actually moves into the brain quite rapidly and quite efficiently. And there it's very, very quickly degraded into 7-HOCA. Okay, so it actually doesn't accumulate except if you have a lot of neuronal death, and then it accumulates as a result of that, because those neurons can't actually now make the enzyme for its metabolism. Okay, it is important for cholesterol elimination from macrophages and arterial endothelial cells, but it's also a ligand for the human estrogen receptor alpha and LXR. So it's actually linked to various diseases such as breast and prostate cancer, bone mineralization, and also metastasis of cancer. And then on the other hand, oxysterols can also inhibit cancer, such as glioblastoma that I mentioned before, leukemia, colon cancer, breast and prostate cancer. So you see where this is going? Yeah, it's pretty confusing. It's hard to know. They have some positive effects and then they have some negative effects, and it's really hard to know which is which. It depends on the tissue, it depends on the context, it depends on the form of oxysterols. Now, when we are talking about atherosclerosis, generally the main oxysterol that we're going to be referencing is one that's called 7-keto-cholesterol. This is the major oxysterol that's produced during oxidation of LDL, and it's very abundant in plasma and atherosclerotic lesions, and it also accumulates in the red blood cells of patients who have heart failure. Okay, so it's associated preferably with membrane lipid rafts and really has high apoptotic potential. So it causes cell death. It's not very easily exported by the macrophages, okay? And this means that we are impairing the efflux of cholesterol from those macrophages. And as a result, we're really promoting the formation of foam cells in those macrophages, okay? So this 7-keto-cholesterol, it seems to have high apoptotic potential, and we can't easily get rid of it. So the efflux is difficult and impaired, and this promotes the formation of those foam cells. And various oxysterols are implicated not only in heart disease and inflammation, but also in things like age-related macular degeneration and cataracts, okay, so eye diseases. All right, and one other thing that I wanted to mention here is how these oxysterols interact with other systems in our body. So when we're talking about the brain and the oxysterols in the brain, there's an article here from the Journal of Biological Chemistry, 2011, by Mateos et al. So this was a while back. And what they were looking at were side chain oxysterols and the interaction with brain RAS. Okay, if you remember, I did a whole episode on RAS, the renin-angiotensin system. And in that episode, I focused specifically on tissue renin-angiotensin system, not the plasma systemic RAS system. Okay, and I spoke about the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system that is complete and intact in the brain. Well, in this case, both 27-hydroxycholesterol and also that 24S-hydroxycholesterol, they are able to upregulate the renin-angiotensin system in the brain. So they interact with RAS in the brain, and this is through LXR. And so these oxysterols are linked to hypertension, and they are also linked to neurodegeneration in patients via the RAS system, which, as I mentioned again, is a highly inflammatory system. And it actually is going to promote the formation of a lot of reactive oxygen species and cause a lot of damage to cells. And we see that there is interaction between these oxysterols and the RAS system in the brain and possibly in other RAS tissue as well. Okay, let's do our very brief wrap up. I started by talking a little bit about cholesterol metabolism and how it's oxidized and eventually broken down into bile acids, and then a lot of the bile acids, 90% of them, actually get recycled back to the liver. And then we talked about oxysterols, which are oxidized cholesterol. And there are many types of oxysterols, and they have different functions in the body. They tend to be more biologically active, especially in signaling, because they can cross membranes very, very quickly. And so they act very rapidly, right, as compared to cholesterol. And then we went on to look at how cholesterol synthesis is regulated in cells. And this is essentially through SREBP2, which is made in the endoplasmic reticulum and then is bound to SCAP protein. And SCAP now translocates SREBP2 to the Golgi. From there, it's processed and activated, and it can now go to the nucleus to be involved in the transcription of various genes that are important for making enzymes for cholesterol biosynthesis. All right, now when we have a lot of cholesterol in the body or in the cell, the cholesterol is actually going to bind to the SCAP protein and cause it to bind to another protein in the endoplasmic reticulum called INSIG. The end result of that is now SCAP is going nowhere. It's not going to be able to take SREBP2 to the Golgi. And now we can't activate the synthesis of cholesterol. Okay. Now, oxysterols do a similar thing. They don't actually bind to SCAP. The difference is they actually bind to INSIG. But the end result is the same. The end result is now SCAP, which is bound to SREBP2, is not able to go to the Golgi. We cannot activate SREBP2, and then we don't have formation of cholesterol in the cell. And then we went on to look at basically, the different functions of these oxysterols in the body. And I talked a little bit about how they're involved in immune regulation, right? So we could consider that an aspect of immunometabolism, for example, because once we stimulate the formation of interferons from macrophages and other antigen-presenting cells, what we are going to do is we're going to upregulate the production of 25-hydroxycholesterol. And this will actually decrease cholesterol biosynthesis in the cell, and as a result prevent interleukin 1 beta from forming. And this is going to be involved in actually not allowing those macrophages to become pro-inflammatory. Then we have cholesterol-dependent cytolysins, which can actually form pores in cells and cause them to lyse and die. And these are, formed in certain bacteria like Clostridium. Now, when we have 24-hydroxycholesterol, we can protect our immune cells like our macrophages and neutrophils, because that's going to prevent the formation of more cholesterol in those cells. And now the cholesterol-dependent cytolysins from the bacteria cannot bind to our immune cells and cause them to die. So that's one way that we can protect our immune cells. We talked about the brain and how, we have different pools of cholesterol. We have the plasma cholesterol, and then we have the pool of cholesterol that's actually made in the brain. And those pools generally don't mix. But we do have oxysterols that are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Generally, you don't have cholesterol crossing that blood-brain barrier, but the oxysterols, again, because they cross these membranes very easily, they're able to go in and out of the brain. So from the brain side, we have the formation of 24-hydroxycholesterol, and that's made in the brain, and then it's actually going to go into the plasma, and from there transported via lipoproteins to the liver, and then we convert that to bile acids, and that's how we get rid of that cholesterol. But from the plasma side, we have 27 hydroxycholesterol, and that can diffuse into the brain. And it's normally very rapidly processed in the brain. There's an enzyme in the brains, the CYP7B1, and that enzyme is actually going to break down 27 hydroxycholesterol very, very rapidly. But when you have situations of a lot of neuronal death, then you don't have a lot of that enzyme production, and you have this 27 hydroxycholesterol, starting to build up in those brains, and it may have an impact to neurodegeneration. It's also been linked, this 27 hydroxycholesterol, to different cancers. But then we see, on the other hand, that oxysterols can actually inhibit some cancers as well. So you get some pluses and minuses there. And then we briefly went into 7-keto cholesterol, which is the major oxysterol that we see with the oxidation of LDL, and it's found in those atherosclerotic plaques. So that's why it got a lot of attention. And it generally is going to make it very difficult for efflux of cholesterol, because that form of oxidized cholesterol really doesn't get effluxed easily. And now it gets stuck in those macrophages that are in the plaques. And we now stimulate the formation of foam cells. Okay. And we then talked about how these different side chain oxysterols can interact with the renin-angiotensin system. We looked at how they can upregulate the RAS in brain tissue, and there's a possibility that oxysterols may be able to upregulate RAS in other RAS-containing tissue as well. Okay, so now that we've kind of generally looked at oxysterols in the body, what can we do to, kind of not accumulate too many of these oxysterols in our body? Now, this is a tough one, because as you saw, the oxysterols they're bioactive, and they're very important in signaling, and they can have actually pro and anti-inflammatory results, right? So, which oxysterol and which ones were affecting, that's going to be very difficult to assess and to, kind of address. In general, obviously, you want to decrease overall oxidative stress in your body. So paying attention to nutrition, you want to cut out processed foods, because a lot of oxidized cholesterol products will be found in processed foods. And also specifically, when you look at the literature, they reference powdered meat and powdered eggs. So might I suggest that you avoid eating powdered meat and powdered eggs? And I'm sure this is not going to be difficult for most people, right? Just eat the meat in its meat form and cut out the powdered form. So you also want to cut out smoking and alcohol, because these are toxins that can cause modification and oxidation of those cholesterol products. Definitely want to pay attention to your sleep to make sure you have good sleep, good quality of sleep, and also address mental health, because we can generate a lot of stress if we're not careful with our mental health. So those are the general things I think that we need to do to avoid kind of loading your body with oxidative stress in general. Now, this idea of decreasing cholesterol in the body is at best naive, in my humble opinion, right? Because you can see, first of all, how important cholesterol is to life, to signaling, to membranes, and really, those lipid rafts where most of your signaling occurs, right? How important it is to it has some really important biological effects, and it can be very helpful. It can be, in some cases, good for inhibiting certain cancers even, right? And yet, under certain conditions and certain forms of oxysterols can cause disease. So just to say, let's just wipe out all cholesterol. And, that tends to be the thinking nowadays, because I'm seeing that they want to get patients' cholesterols down to zero pretty much, which is incompatible with life. In my opinion, I don't know what the thinking is, but it's just this, oh, we must get rid of all cholesterol, even though it is necessary to have cholesterol. And it might be that there's just so little cholesterol in the brain that the brain isn't functioning, and that's why we're thinking that way. I don't know. But so when we interfere with cholesterol regulation that way en masse, I just think that now we're really disrupting cholesterol homeostasis in the body, because really you can see that the cell knows how to regulate its own cholesterol. And when we have high intracellular levels of cholesterol, it's going to downregulate synthesis and upregulate export of that cholesterol, right? So it has its own ways of regulating that cholesterol pool. And again, we're mainly talking about the accessible pool, because, we have, a lot of the cholesterol that's bound in those lipid rafts and are sequestered as well. So I think the body generally, my humble opinion, knows what it's doing. And to just kind of have this blanket approach of let's just wipe out all cholesterol in the body, I don't think is wise, and will have profound immune regulation results and impact, and profound impact to formation of hormones, for example, and overall health in the body. So my take on this is, again, cholesterol itself isn't a problem, and even oxidized cholesterol itself, that general category of oxidized cholesterol, isn't a problem, because you can see it has so many effects that we can't make a blanket statement about those oxysterols. So really the best way to look at this is to look at the context and to approach it by decreasing overall oxidative stress. In certain cases and in certain patients, for a limited amount of time, I may focus on anti-inflammatory strategies. But those I don't do forever and ever, just because, we have to have the balance between inflammation and, anti-inflammatory processes in the body. You can't just have, only anti-inflammatory processes happening, because, in the extreme, that would be immunosuppression. Okay, and that's bad. So we have to have that balance. So I generally don't interfere with that homeostasis long term. In a specific context, you might want to address it for a certain period of time. Okay, so that's just my take. I hope that you found this episode on cholesterol and oxysterols interesting, and maybe we can start a conversation about cholesterol in a more sort of insightful way and be less reactionary. Okay, that was my take on cholesterol and oxysterols. Just subscribe to my newsletter on my website, vivianlohmd.com, VYVYANELOHMD.com. You can also check out the events schedule there, and that will tell you when the next live Q&A would be. And if you are unable to attend those sessions but you have questions for me, just write to me and I can bring them up during the live Q&A and answer them during those sessions. Or, generally I do write. I'm pretty good at writing back if people have questions. All right, signing out now from VLMD Rounds. I'm Dr. Vivian Loh, and I sing the body electric. Bye for now.